The sun was beating down hard on the dusty streets of Socorro, New Mexico. Miguel Rodriguez wiped the sweat from his forehead as he walked through the small town. His cattle ranch wasn't doing well. The drought had been going on for months, and he was running out of money fast. Miguel had come to town to buy some cheap supplies, but instead, he found himself standing in front of an old building where people were gathering. A sign said, "Property auction today." He thought maybe he could find some used tools or equipment for a good price. The auctioneer was a thin man with a loud voice. He stood on a wooden box calling out items one by one. Miguel watched as people bid on old furniture, farm equipment, and small pieces of land. Most things were selling for more money than Miguel had in his pocket. Then the auctioneer pointed to a rundown cabin at the edge of the property. The little building looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The wooden walls were gray and cracked. Some of the roof tiles were missing. Weeds grew up around the foundation so thick you could barely see the bottom of the walls. "Next up, we have this charming little cabin," the auctioneer said with a grin. "Perfect for storage or maybe a weekend getaway. Who'll start the bidding at $50. The crowd was silent. People looked at the cabin and shook their heads. Miguel could hear someone behind him whisper, "Nobody's going near that place." Another person said, "That cabin's been empty for good reason." "Come on now," the auctioneer called out. "How about $25? Still nothing. The silence stretched on. Miguel noticed how the local people seemed to avoid even looking at the cabin. Their faces showed something that looked almost like fear. An old woman near the front of the crowd crossed herself and looked away. $15? $10? The auctioneer was getting desperate. "This is prime real estate, folks." Miguel felt sorry for the man. Without really thinking about it, he raised his hand. "I'll give you 12 pesos, he called out. That was about 65 cents in American money. It was almost all the cash he had left in his wallet. The crowd turned to stare at Miguel. The auctioneer looked surprised but happy. "We have 12 pesos. Do I hear any other bids?" The silence was even deeper now. People were looking at Miguel like he had just volunteered to jump off a cliff. Some folks started backing away from him. The old woman who had crossed herself earlier shook her head sadly and walked away completely. Going once, going twice. Sold to the gentleman in the blue shirt for 12 pesos. Miguel couldn't believe it. He owned property now. Sure, it was just an old cabin that nobody else wanted, but it was his. As he walked up to sign the papers, he felt excited for the first time in months. Maybe he could fix up the cabin and use it to store hay or tools. Maybe his luck was finally changing. The auctioneer handed him a rusty key and a piece of paper with the property details. "Congratulations," he said, but his smile looked forced. "You're now the proud owner of the old Henderson cabin." As Miguel walked back through the crowd, he tried to catch people's eyes to smile and maybe celebrate his purchase. But everyone looked away. A man in overalls muttered, "Poor fellow doesn't know what he's gotten himself into." "Know what I've gotten into?" Miguel asked. But the man had already walked away. An elderly Mexican woman selling fruit from a cart grabbed Miguel's arm as he passed. "Mijo," she said quietly, "you should sell that place back. Don't go inside. That cabin, it's not right." "What do you mean?" Miguel asked. "What's wrong with it?" But the woman just shook her head and let go of his arm. "Some places are left empty for good reasons," she said. "You'll see." Miguel drove home that evening feeling confused but still excited. He kept looking at the key in his hand and the property deed on his passenger seat. Whatever was wrong with the cabin, it couldn't be that bad. People in small towns always had strange stories about old buildings. Maybe someone had died there years ago, and that's why folks were spooked. He spent the next 2 days planning what he would do with his new property. He made a list of supplies he would need to clean it up. He imagined himself fixing the roof and painting the walls. It would be perfect for storing his ranch equipment away from the weather. Miguel had no idea that in just a few days his 12 peso purchase would change his life forever. He had no clue that the locals' fear was based on something much more serious than old ghost stories, and he definitely didn't know that something was waiting for him inside that cabin, something that had been hanging there, patient and still, for more than 50 years. The key felt warm in his pocket as he made plans to visit his new property. He was about to discover that some bargains come with a price that can't be measured in money. 3 days after the auction, Miguel loaded his old pickup truck with cleaning supplies, tools, and a thermos of coffee. He had been thinking about the cabin nonstop. The more he planned, the more excited he got about having his own storage space. His ranch was small and he was always running out of room for equipment. The drive to the cabin took about 20 minutes on dusty back roads. As Miguel got closer, he started noticing how isolated the place really was. There were no other buildings around for miles. The landscape was mostly desert scrub, scattered rocks, and the occasional cactus. It was the kind of place where you could scream and nobody would hear you. When he pulled up to the cabin, it looked even more run down than he remembered. In the bright morning sunlight, he could see just how bad the damage was. Some of the wooden boards were completely rotted through. The front porch was sagging on one side. The door was painted green once, but now it was mostly just bare wood with a few flakes of old paint hanging on. Miguel grabbed his tools and walked up to the front door. The wooden steps creaked under his feet, and one board felt soft enough that he worried it might break. He pulled out the rusty key the auctioneer had given him and tried to fit it into the lock. The key wouldn't turn at first. Miguel had to wiggle it around and put his shoulder against the door to get it to work. When the lock finally clicked, he felt a little proud of himself. He was already solving problems and making progress, but when he tried to push the door open, it barely moved. Something was blocking it from the inside. Miguel put his full weight against the door and shoved hard. It opened about 6 inches, then stopped. He could hear something scraping against the floor inside. "Come on," Miguel muttered, pushing harder. Whatever was blocking the door finally gave way, and the door swung open with a loud groan. The smell hit him immediately. It wasn't the smell of death or anything scary like that. It was more like old dust, stale air, and something else he couldn't identify. Like the cabin had been holding its breath for decades and had finally exhaled. Miguel stepped inside and immediately realized how dark it was. All the windows were boarded up from the inside. Only thin strips of sunlight came through the cracks between the boards. The air felt thick and heavy, like it hadn't moved in years. He pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. The small beam of light showed him a room that was bigger than it looked from outside. There was old furniture covered in white sheets. Dust was everywhere, so thick that his footsteps left clear prints on the floor. Miguel took a few more steps inside, sweeping his phone light around the room. He could see an old stone fireplace on one wall and what looked like a kitchen area in the back. This place had definitely been someone's home once. Then his light hit something in the center of the room that made him freeze. There was a thick wooden beam running across the ceiling, and something large was hanging from it. In the dim light from his phone, Miguel could see the shape of what looked like a person, a very tall person. His heart started beating faster. "Hello?" he called out, even though he knew that was stupid. If someone was hanging from the ceiling, they probably couldn't answer. Miguel's hands were shaking as he moved his phone light slowly upward. The figure hanging from the beam was definitely human-shaped, but something was wrong with the size. It was too big. Way too big. He needed more light. Miguel remembered he had a heavy-duty flashlight in his truck. His first instinct was to run outside and call the police, but something made him stop. The figure wasn't moving at all. It had been hanging there when he opened the door, and it was still hanging there now. Whatever this was, it wasn't alive. Miguel backed toward the door, keeping his phone light pointed at the hanging figure. He couldn't make out details, but he could see long, dark hair and what looked like old clothes. And the size. This person had to be almost 8 feet tall. Outside, Miguel sat in his truck for a few minutes, trying to calm down. He took deep breaths and drank some coffee from his thermos. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe it was just a very tall mannequin or some kind of art project. People did weird things in old cabins sometimes. But even as he tried to convince himself it was nothing serious, Miguel couldn't shake the feeling that he had just discovered something incredible. Something that had been waiting in that dark cabin for a very long time. He grabbed his heavy flashlight from the toolbox in his truck bed. Whatever was hanging in there, he needed to see it clearly. Miguel Rodriguez was about to get his first real look at something that would change everything he thought he knew about the world. Miguel gripped his heavy flashlight tight as he walked back into the cabin. His heart was still pounding, but he had to know what he was dealing with. He couldn't just leave without understanding what was hanging from that beam. This time, when he stepped inside, he went straight to the center of the room. He raised his flashlight and clicked it on, sending a bright beam of light directly at the hanging figure. What he saw made him drop the flashlight completely. It was definitely a woman, but unlike any woman Miguel had ever seen. She was massive, at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. Her long black hair hung down past her shoulders, and her skin had a strange preserved look to it. Not like a mummy, but not like a living person either. She was wearing traditional Native American clothing, a beautifully decorated dress made of leather and beads. The craftsmanship was incredible. Even in the dim light, Miguel could see intricate patterns and designs that must have taken months to create. Her feet were bare, and they were proportioned to match her giant size. Miguel picked up his flashlight with shaking hands and aimed it at her face. What he saw there made him step back in shock. Her features were strong and noble, with high cheekbones and a straight nose. Her eyes were closed, but her expression was peaceful, almost serene. She looked young, maybe in her 20s, despite the obvious age of her clothing and the situation. The most incredible thing was how well preserved she was. Miguel had seen old corpses before, cattle that had died on his ranch, wildlife he'd found in the desert. Dead things rotted quickly in the New Mexico heat. But this woman looked like she could have died yesterday, not decades ago. She was suspended from the ceiling beam by what looked like braided leather ropes. The ropes were wrapped around her wrists and attached to iron hooks that had been driven deep into the wooden beam. But here's what really confused Miguel. The ropes didn't look like they were meant to harm her. They looked almost ceremonial, like she had been placed there with respect and care. Miguel walked slowly around the hanging figure, keeping his flashlight trained on her. From every angle, she was incredible. Her hands were enormous but graceful. Her arms showed the muscle tone of someone who had been very strong in life. Everything about her suggested power and dignity. On the floor directly beneath her, Miguel noticed something else strange. The wooden floorboards were marked with what looked like giant footprints pressed deep into the wood. The prints were much larger than any normal person could make. They matched the size of the woman's feet perfectly. Miguel knelt down and traced one of the footprints with his finger. The wood was pressed down as if someone incredibly heavy had been walking around this room, but that didn't make sense if the woman had been hanging from the ceiling all this time. As he stood up, his flashlight beam caught something else that made his blood run cold. The wooden beam she was hanging from had deep scratch marks gouged into the wood. They looked like claw marks, but they were huge, made by fingers that could grip and tear wood like it was soft clay. Miguel backed away from the hanging figure and aimed his light around the rest of the room. Now he started noticing other details he had missed before. There were more of those giant footprints leading from the center of the room to different corners. Some of the old furniture was broken, but not from age. It looked like it had been crushed by incredible strength. On one wall, there were more scratch marks, these ones forming what looked almost like writing. Miguel couldn't read it, but the symbols looked Native American. They were carved deep into the wooden wall, again showing the kind of strength that shouldn't be humanly possible. The strangest thing of all was that Miguel wasn't scared anymore. Standing in that room, looking at this impossible woman, he felt something else entirely. He felt like he was in the presence of something sacred, something important that had been hidden away and forgotten. He walked back to stand directly in front of her. In the bright beam of his flashlight, he could see every detail of her face clearly. There was something noble about her features, something that spoke of strength and wisdom. Her closed eyes gave her an expression of eternal peace. Miguel found himself speaking to her, even though he knew it was crazy. "Who were you?" he whispered. "How did you get here? And why are you so big?" Of course, she didn't answer. But as Miguel stood there in the silent cabin, he started to understand that he had stumbled onto something much bigger than an old building to use for storage. This woman, whoever she was, had a story, and somehow Miguel had become part of that story. He spent another hour in the cabin, documenting everything he could see with his phone camera. Every angle of the woman, every footprint, every scratch mark on the walls. He knew that nobody would believe him without proof. As he finally prepared to leave, Miguel felt like the cabin had revealed its first secret to him. But he had a feeling this was just the beginning. This giant Apache woman hanging in his 12-peso cabin was going to change his life in ways he couldn't even imagine yet. Miguel spent the next 3 days unable to think about anything except the giant woman in his cabin. He couldn't eat properly, couldn't sleep well, and kept looking at the photos on his phone to make sure he hadn't imagined the whole thing. The images were real, but they seemed impossible. He knew he needed help understanding what he had found. Miguel had never been the type to believe in supernatural things, but this situation was beyond anything normal people dealt with. He needed someone with knowledge about Native American history and culture. After asking around town carefully, Miguel learned about Dr. Elena Whitehorse. She was a professor at the University of New Mexico who specialized in Apache history and culture. People said she was one of the few non-native experts that local tribes actually trusted and respected. Miguel called the university and somehow managed to get through to Dr. Whitehorse directly. When he started explaining what he had found, she initially sounded skeptical. Professors probably got calls from crazy people all the time claiming they had discovered amazing things. "Sir, I appreciate your interest in Apache culture," Dr. Whitehorse said politely. "But extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Do you have any photographs?" Miguel sent her 3 of his clearest photos. There was a long silence on the phone after that. "Where did you say this cabin was located?" Dr. Whitehorse asked, and her voice had completely changed. She sounded excited now, almost breathless. 2 days later, Dr. Whitehorse arrived at Miguel's ranch in a university vehicle loaded with equipment. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her eyes were sharp and intelligent, and she moved with the confidence of someone who had spent years studying mysteries. "Before we go to the cabin," she said, "I need to tell you what you might have discovered. Have you ever heard of the legend of the tall woman of the mountains?" Miguel shook his head. "I don't know much about Apache stories." Dr. Whitehorse pulled out a thick folder filled with papers and old photographs. "According to oral traditions passed down through Apache families, there was a woman warrior in the 1870s who was unlike any other. The stories describe her as being nearly 8 feet tall, with incredible strength and wisdom. She was called different names: Mountain Guardian, Tall Sister, or most commonly, the Tall Woman of the Mountains." She showed Miguel drawings that had been made by Apache artists over the years, trying to preserve the memory of this legendary figure. The drawings showed a towering woman in traditional dress, standing protectively over smaller people. The Apache people were going through terrible times in the 1870s. Dr. Whitehorse continued. The U.S. government was forcing them off their traditional lands. Many were being killed or sent to reservations far from their homes. According to the stories, the tall woman appeared during this dark period to help protect her people. Miguel studied the drawings. They looked remarkably similar to what he had seen hanging in his cabin. "But these are just legends, right? Stories people told?" "That's what I thought until I saw your photographs," Dr. Whitehorse admitted. "But here's the thing. Multiple Apache families from different bands all tell similar stories about this woman. They describe her appearance, her clothing, even specific events she was involved in. When different groups tell the same story independently, historians start paying attention." She pulled out more documents. "I've been researching this legend for 15 years. There are references to the tall woman in old military reports from Fort Stanton. Soldiers wrote about encounters with an unusually large Apache woman who seemed to appear and disappear like a ghost. They called her a giant and claimed she could move faster and fight harder than any warrior they had ever faced." Miguel felt chills running down his arms. "What happened to her?" "According to the Apache oral tradition, she sacrificed herself to save her people during a particularly brutal military campaign. The stories say she made a deal with the spirits. She would give up her life in exchange for protection for the surviving Apache families. After that, she vanished. No one knew what happened to her body." Dr. Whitehorse closed the folder and looked directly at Miguel. "Until now, I thought these were just beautiful stories meant to give people hope during a dark time." "But your photographs. They show exactly what the Apache elders have been describing for over 150 years. They drove to the cabin together, Dr. Whitehorse asking Miguel detailed questions about how he had discovered the place and what he had observed. When they arrived, she spent several minutes just looking at the outside of the building. "This cabin was built in the 1920s, she said, examining the construction style. "But according to land records, this area was considered sacred by local Apache bands. They would have fought to prevent anyone from building here unless there was a very important reason." Inside the cabin, Dr. Whitehorse's reaction was even stronger than Miguel had expected. When her flashlight illuminated the hanging woman, she actually gasped and took several steps backward. "My God," she whispered. "It's her. It's actually her." For the next hour, Dr. Whitehorse examined every detail of the scene with the careful attention of a scientist and the reverence of someone who understood the cultural significance of what they were seeing. She took measurements, photographs, and notes on everything from the woman's clothing to the ceremonial way she had been suspended from the beam. "Miguel," she said finally. "You haven't just found an old body. You've discovered one of the most important archaeological and cultural finds in southwestern history. This woman, if she really is the tall woman of the mountains, represents a bridge between legend and reality. She's proof that some of the stories we thought were just myths were actually based on real people and real events." As they prepared to leave the cabin, Dr. Whitehorse turned to Miguel with a serious expression. "You need to understand something. This discovery is going to change everything. Once word gets out, you're going to have scientists, journalists, government officials, and tribal representatives all wanting to be involved. Are you prepared for that?" Miguel looked back at the cabin, thinking about the peaceful expression on the giant woman's face. "I just want to do right by her," he said. "Whatever that means." Dr. Whitehorse nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right attitude, because this story is just beginning." Within a week of Dr. Whitehorse's visit, Miguel's quiet cabin had become the center of intense scientific activity. The professor had contacted colleagues from multiple universities, and now experts in archaeology, forensic science, and anthropology were arriving daily to examine the giant woman. The first team to arrive was led by Dr. James Chen, a forensic anthropologist from Arizona State University. Dr. Chen specialized in examining old remains and had worked on cases involving bodies that were hundreds of years old. But even he seemed amazed by what he found in Miguel's cabin. "In 30 years of doing this work," Dr. Chen told Miguel, "I've never seen preservation like this. Bodies from the 1870s should be completely decomposed by now, especially in this climate. Yet her tissue, her hair, even her clothing, everything is intact." The team set up sophisticated equipment inside the cabin, including special cameras, measuring devices, and tools for taking tiny samples without damaging the woman's body. They worked with incredible care, treating her with the respect they would show to any person, living or dead. The first major discovery came when they used carbon dating on a small sample of her hair. The results showed that she had indeed died sometime between 1870 and 1880, exactly matching the time period mentioned in Apache oral traditions. This wasn't some recent hoax or modern art project. This woman had been hanging in this location for well over a century, but the carbon dating results only made the preservation mystery deeper. Dr. Chen brought in a specialist in environmental preservation, Dr. Lisa Martinez, to try to understand how the body could have remained so intact for so long. "There's no evidence of any chemical preservation," Dr. Martinez explained to Miguel. "No embalming fluids, no natural preservatives, nothing that would explain this level of preservation. The cabin has normal temperature fluctuations, normal humidity levels. By all the rules of science, this should be impossible." The team also made detailed measurements of the woman's body. She was exactly 7 feet and 11 inches tall, making her a true giant by any standard. Her bone structure was proportionally correct for her height, suggesting this wasn't some medical condition that caused abnormal growth. She appeared to have been naturally incredibly tall. As the scientists worked, they began discovering other mysterious aspects of the scene. The giant footprints pressed into the wooden floor weren't just impressions. They were deep gouges that showed the woman had weighed far more than even her great height would suggest. The math didn't add up. "According to her body measurements, she should weigh maybe 300 pounds, Dr. Chen said, puzzled. "But these footprint impressions suggest someone weighing 500 or 600 pounds. Either she was incredibly dense or something else was going on." The scratch marks on the wooden beams became even more mysterious under scientific examination. The team brought in a wood expert who confirmed that the marks had been made by human fingernails. But the force required to gouge such deep marks into hardwood should have been impossible for any person to generate. "Look at this," Dr. Martinez said, showing Miguel photographs of the scratch marks under magnification. "These aren't random scratches. They form patterns almost like writing. And the depth of the cuts. It's like she had superhuman strength." The team also discovered something that hadn't been visible in Miguel's initial exploration. Hidden beneath decades of dust in one corner of the cabin, they found a collection of traditional Apache artifacts. There were pottery pieces, tools made from stone and bone, and several items that appeared to be ceremonial in nature. Dr. Whitehorse was called in to examine these artifacts. Her excitement was obvious as she carefully cleaned and studied each piece. "These are pre-reservation items," she told the team. "They're from the period when Apache bands were still living freely in the mountains. But here's what's strange. Some of these artifacts are larger than normal. This pottery bowl, for instance, is sized for someone with very large hands. And this ceremonial staff, it's much longer and heavier than typical examples. The most intriguing discovery came when they found what appeared to be a journal hidden in a wooden box beneath the cabin's floorboards. The journal was written in English, but the handwriting was old-fashioned and difficult to read. Dr. Whitehorse worked for hours to decipher the faded ink. It appears to be written by someone named Thomas Henderson, she announced. He was apparently the original builder of this cabin. Listen to this entry from 1923. The Apache elders came to me again today. They say the sacred woman must be protected in this place. They helped me build the cabin around her resting spot. They say she gave her life for her people and must not be disturbed. Another entry from 1924 was even more revealing. Sometimes at dawn, I see her walking near the cabin. The elders say this is normal, that her spirit watches over the land. I am honored to be the guardian of this place, though I admit it frightens me sometimes. The journal contained dozens of similar entries spanning several decades. Henderson wrote about strange lights near the cabin, about wildlife behaving unusually, and about visits from Apache people who came to pay their respects to the woman he called the guardian. As the scientific investigation continued, more questions arose than answers. Every test, every measurement, every analysis seemed to confirm that this giant Apache woman was real, but also that there were aspects of her existence that science couldn't explain. Dr. Chen summed up the team's findings during a meeting with Miguel and Dr. Whitehorse. We can confirm that this woman lived and died in the 1870s. We can confirm her extraordinary size and the remarkable preservation of her remains. We can confirm that she possessed unusual physical strength, but we cannot explain how any of this is possible, according to current scientific understanding. Miguel looked at the giant woman hanging peacefully in his cabin and felt a growing sense that they were dealing with something far beyond normal human experience. The scientific investigation had confirmed that his discovery was real and historically significant. But it had also confirmed that some mysteries might be too big for science alone to solve. The next phase of this incredible story was about to begin, and Miguel sensed it would involve more than just scientists and professors. Something this sacred to Apache culture would surely draw the attention of the people whose ancestors had known the tall woman of the mountains personally. Word of the discovery had been spreading quietly through academic circles, but it was only a matter of time before it reached the Apache communities of New Mexico. Miguel had been expecting this moment, but he still felt nervous when 3 vehicles pulled up to his ranch on a sunny Thursday morning. The delegation from the Mescalero Apache reservation was led by an elderly man named Joseph Standing. Bare. He was in his 70s, with long gray hair braided down his back and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of decades spent outdoors. With him were 2 younger men who introduced themselves as tribal council members, and a woman about Miguel's age who served as a cultural preservation specialist. "We come in peace," Joseph said when Miguel met them at his front door, "but we come with serious purpose. You have found something that belongs to our people." Miguel invited them inside and offered coffee, which they accepted gratefully. As they sat around his kitchen table, Joseph explained how they had learned about the discovery. "Dr. Whitehorse contacted our tribal cultural office," he said. "She knows the proper protocols for discoveries like this. We appreciate that she reached out to us immediately, rather than letting this become a media circus first." Joseph's manner was calm and dignified, but Miguel could sense the deep emotion beneath his composed exterior. "The woman you found? We have been waiting for her to come home for more than 150 years. You know who she is?" Miguel asked. The elderly man nodded slowly. "Her name was Maria Mountain Walker. In our language, we called her something that translates to tall sister of the sacred peaks. She was my great-great-grandmother's cousin." Joseph began to tell a story that had been passed down through his family for generations. Unlike the general legends Dr. Whitehorse had shared, this was personal history, filled with specific details that only family members would know. "Maria was born during the time when our people still lived freely in the mountains," he said. "Even as a child she was different. Not just her size, though she grew to be taller than any person we had known. She also had abilities that seemed to come from the spirit world. She could track animals across rock, could see in the dark, could move without making sound." According to Joseph's family history, Maria had become a war leader during the conflicts with the U.S. military in the 1870s. While other Apache leaders like Geronimo are remembered in history books, Maria's story had been kept alive only in oral traditions. She led our warriors against the soldiers many times, Joseph continued, but she was also a peacemaker. She always tried to find ways to protect our people without unnecessary bloodshed. The military feared her because she seemed to be everywhere at once, but she only fought when our families were threatened. The woman traveling with Joseph, who had introduced herself as Rosa Deer Runner, spoke up. Our oral histories tell us that Maria made a final sacrifice to end the violence. She went to the spirits and offered her own life in exchange for protection for the surviving Apache families. What kind of protection? Miguel asked. Safe passage to the reservations without being hunted or killed along the way, Rosa explained. At that time, many Apache families were being murdered during forced relocations. The spirits accepted Maria's offer, but they demanded that her body be preserved as a guardian, watching over the land and our people. Joseph reached into a leather bag he had brought with him and pulled out several old photographs and documents. These are pictures of Maria taken by a sympathetic military photographer in 1876, he said, handing them to Miguel. The black and white photographs were faded and grainy, but they clearly showed a woman of extraordinary height standing among a group of Apache people. She towered over everyone else, but her face showed the same noble features Miguel had seen in the cabin. It was definitely the same person. How did she end up in that specific location? Miguel asked. Joseph and Rosa exchanged glances before Joseph answered. According to our traditions, Maria chose that spot herself. It was already sacred to our people, a place where warriors had been buried for centuries. When she knew her time had come, she went there to complete her sacrifice. Rosa continued the story. The spirits preserved her body as part of the agreement, but they also demanded that she be protected and honored by both Apache people and any others who lived in the area. That's why sympathetic settlers like Thomas Henderson built the cabin around her resting place. The delegation spent the next several hours with Miguel, sharing stories and family memories about Maria Mountain Walker. They showed him more photographs, drawings made by Apache artists over the years, and even some pieces of traditional clothing that had belonged to Maria's family. As the afternoon wore on, Miguel began to understand that this wasn't just an archaeological discovery or a historical curiosity. For the Apache people, finding Maria was like reuniting with a beloved family member who had been missing for generations. We would like to see her, Joseph said finally. With your permission, we want to visit the cabin and pay our respects. Miguel readily agreed, and the entire group drove to the cabin together. When they arrived, Joseph asked Miguel to wait outside while the Apache delegation entered first. Miguel respected their request and sat in his truck, watching through the open cabin door. What he witnessed was deeply moving. Joseph and the others spent over an hour inside the cabin, speaking in their native language. Miguel could hear what sounded like prayers or ceremonial chants. At one point, Rosa emerged from the cabin with tears streaming down her face. When they finally invited Miguel to join them inside, the atmosphere in the cabin felt different. There was a sense of peace and completion that hadn't been there before. She knows we found her, Joseph said simply. After all these years, she knows her people remember her and honor her sacrifice. As they prepared to leave, Joseph turned to Miguel with a serious expression. This discovery raises important questions about what happens next. Maria belongs with her people, but she also belongs to history. We need to find a way to honor both her wishes and her significance to the world. Miguel nodded, understanding that his role in this story was far from over. The 12-peso cabin had brought him much more than he had bargained for. It had made him a caretaker of one of the most important cultural treasures in the American Southwest. The real challenge was just beginning: how to properly honor Maria Mountain Walker while sharing her incredible story with a world that was about to learn that some legends are absolutely true. Something changed after the Apache delegation's visit to the cabin. Miguel couldn't put his finger on exactly what was different, but the entire area around the property felt more alive, more aware. It was as if Maria Mountain Walker's presence had been awakened by the recognition and respect shown by her people. The first sign that something unusual was happening came 3 nights after. Joseph Standing Bear and his group had visited. Miguel was sitting on his ranch porch, enjoying his evening coffee and looking out toward the distant cabin. when he saw something that made him nearly drop his mug. A tall figure was walking slowly around the cabin in the moonlight. Even from a distance of nearly half a mile, Miguel could tell that the figure was much larger than a normal person. It moved with a graceful flowing gait that seemed almost to glide across the desert ground. Miguel grabbed his binoculars and focused on the area around the cabin. The figure was definitely there. A woman in traditional Native American dress, easily 8 feet tall, moving in a wide circle around the building. She appeared to be solid and real, not transparent like the ghosts in movies. He watched for nearly 20 minutes as the figure continued her peaceful patrol around the cabin. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she simply wasn't there anymore. Miguel blinked and looked again, but the area around the cabin was empty. The next morning, Miguel drove to the cabin to check for footprints or any other evidence of the nighttime visitor. What he found confirmed that he hadn't been seeing things. There were large footprints in the soft earth around the cabin, the same size and shape as the prints pressed into the wooden floor inside. But these prints weren't just marks in the dirt. They were pressed deep into the hard-packed desert soil, showing incredible weight and pressure. Some of the prints crossed areas where cacti and desert scrub had been growing, but the plants weren't damaged or broken. It was as if the figure had walked through them without disturbing them at all. Miguel called Dr. Whitehorse to report what he had seen. She listened carefully to his description and asked him to take detailed photographs of the footprints. When she saw the pictures, her reaction surprised him. "Miguel, I need to tell you something," she said during their phone call. "You're not the first person to report seeing Maria since we found her. I've been getting calls from people living within a 10-mile radius of your cabin. They're all describing the same thing, a very tall Native American woman walking near their properties at dawn or dusk." Dr. Whitehorse had been documenting these reports carefully. A rancher 5 miles north had seen the figure crossing his pasture at sunrise. A family camping in the area reported that their horses had become agitated in the middle of the night, and when they looked outside their tent, they saw a giant woman standing at the edge of their campsite. She didn't threaten them or try to communicate. She just stood there for a few minutes, then walked away into the darkness. But here's the really interesting part, Dr. Whitehorse continued. Everyone who has seen her reports the same feeling afterward. They say they felt protected, like she was watching over them. Nobody has been frightened by these encounters. The scientist in Dr. Whitehorse was struggling with these reports, but she couldn't ignore the consistent pattern of sightings. She decided to set up motion-activated cameras around Miguel's cabin to see if they could capture any evidence of these supernatural visits. The cameras recorded something extraordinary on their very first night. The footage showed the cabin area empty and quiet until about 3 a.m., when a tall figure simply appeared near the building. The cameras captured her walking around the cabin, occasionally stopping to touch the walls or look up at the sky. Her movements were natural and human-like, but there was something ethereal about her presence. The most amazing part of the footage was what happened when she approached one of the cameras directly. For just a moment, her face was clearly visible in the infrared recording. It was definitely Maria Mountain Walker, the same features Miguel had seen hanging from the cabin beam, but now animated and aware. She seemed to look directly into the camera, and her expression was peaceful but alert. Then she reached out toward the camera and the recording stopped. When the cameras began working again an hour later, the figure was gone. Dr. Whitehorse brought the footage to the Apache delegation, wanting their perspective on what they were documenting. Joseph Standing Bear's reaction was not surprise, but rather a kind of satisfied understanding. "Of course she walks," he said matter-of-factly. "Her spirit never left this place. Finding her body and showing her proper respect has allowed her to manifest more fully. She is doing what she has always done, protecting the land and the people." Rosa Deer Runner explained that in Apache tradition, powerful spiritual beings often continued to interact with the physical world after death, especially if they had made sacred agreements with the spirits. Maria promised to be a guardian. She is keeping that promise. The supernatural activity around the cabin intensified over the following weeks. Miguel started leaving offerings near the cabin, traditional foods like corn and wild plants that Dr. Whitehorse said would be appropriate. The offerings were always gone by the next morning, though no animals or insects were ever seen taking them. Wildlife behavior in the area became noticeably different. Coyotes, which normally avoided human activity, began gathering near the cabin at dusk. They didn't howl or show any signs of aggression. They simply sat in a circle around the building as if keeping watch. Eagles and hawks were seen circling overhead during the day, far more than was normal for the area. Miguel also began experiencing vivid dreams about Maria and the Apache people of the 1870s. In these dreams, he saw scenes of her life, leading warriors into battle, protecting families during dangerous journeys, and finally making her sacrifice to ensure her people's survival. The dreams felt incredibly real, like memories rather than imagination. Dr. Whitehorse was documenting all of these phenomena, trying to find scientific explanations while also respecting the cultural and spiritual significance of what was happening. We're dealing with something that exists at the intersection of history, culture, and the supernatural, she told Miguel. Science can document what's happening, but it may not be able to explain all of it. The most profound experience came when Miguel was alone at the cabin one evening, updating some of the protective equipment Dr. Whitehorse had installed. As the sun was setting, he became aware that he was no longer alone. Maria Mountain Walker was standing just outside the cabin door. For the first time, Miguel was face to face with the giant Apache woman. She was even more impressive in person. Not just her size, but the sense of power and wisdom that radiated from her presence. Her eyes met his, and Miguel felt a wave of gratitude and approval wash over him. She didn't speak, but Miguel somehow understood what she was communicating. She was thanking him for treating her with respect, for bringing her people to her, and for helping to share her story with the world. Then, as gently as she had appeared, she faded away into the desert twilight. Miguel drove home that night knowing that his life had been forever changed by this encounter with something beyond ordinary experience. Maria Mountain Walker was much more than a historical artifact. She was a living presence, still fulfilling her ancient promise to protect her people and the land they loved. The decision about what to do with Maria Mountain Walker and the cabin became the focus of intense but respectful negotiations between Miguel, the Apache Tribal Council, the scientific community, and state officials. Everyone involved understood they were dealing with something unprecedented, a discovery that was simultaneously archaeological, cultural, and spiritual in nature. Joseph Standing Bear and the Tribal Council had initially wanted to move Maria's remains to a traditional burial site on the reservation, but as they learned more about the supernatural activity surrounding the cabin, they began to reconsider. She chose this place for a reason, Joseph explained during one of the many meetings held to discuss the future. Moving her might break the spiritual agreement she made with the spirits. Dr. Whitehorse had been documenting everything meticulously, and her research supported the idea that the cabin location was crucial to Maria's continuing role as a guardian. All the supernatural activity is centered on this specific spot, she pointed out. The historical records show that Apache people traveled here to pay respects for decades after Maria's death. This place is sacred ground. Miguel found himself in the unique position of being the legal owner of one of the most important cultural sites in the Southwest. The 12 pesos he had paid for the cabin now represented ownership of something priceless. But Miguel had never been motivated by money, and his experiences with Maria had changed his perspective on life completely. "I want to do whatever honors her best," Miguel told the group during one of their planning sessions. "She's been taking care of this land for over 150 years. The least I can do is make sure she can continue her work." After months of careful planning and legal negotiations, they reached a solution that satisfied everyone involved. Miguel donated the cabin and 5 acres of surrounding land to a partnership between the Mescalero Apache tribe and the University of New Mexico. The land would be held in trust, ensuring it could never be sold or developed for commercial purposes. The cabin itself was carefully restored using traditional building techniques and materials that would have been available in the 1920s. Maria's remains were left exactly where they had been found, but the building around her was made more accessible for visitors while maintaining the reverent atmosphere of the space. A small museum and cultural center was built nearby, designed in consultation with Apache architects and spiritual leaders. The center tells the complete story of Maria Mountain Walker, her life as a warrior and protector, her sacrifice for her people, and her continuing presence as a guardian spirit. The exhibits include the artifacts found in the cabin, historical photographs, and detailed documentation of the supernatural phenomena that continue to occur in the area. Dr. Whitehorse became the director of the research center, continuing to study and document Maria's story. while also training young Apache scholars to become cultural preservationists themselves. The center has become a place where traditional Apache knowledge and modern scientific methods work together to understand the past and preserve it for the future. Miguel was offered a position as the site caretaker, a role that felt perfect for someone who had developed such a deep connection to Maria and her story. He moved into a small house built on the property, where he can keep watch over the sacred site and welcome visitors who come to learn about the tall woman of the mountains. The supernatural activity around the cabin has continued, but it has become more predictable and peaceful. Maria is most often seen during the early morning hours, walking her protective circuit around the buildings. Visitors sometimes report feeling her presence, a sense of being watched over and protected rather than anything frightening. The wildlife in the area has also settled into new patterns. The coyotes still gather at dusk, but they've become part of the evening routine that visitors can observe. Eagles and hawks circle overhead regularly, and some Apache elders say this is a sign that Maria's spirit is strong and active. Miguel's life has been transformed in ways he never could have imagined when he raised his hand at that auction. His small cattle ranch has become profitable again, partly because of the modest income from his caretaker position, but mostly because the area around Maria's site seems to have become more fertile and productive. His cattle are healthier, his grass grows thicker, and his wells never run dry. But the most important change in Miguel's life has been spiritual. His encounters with Maria have given him a sense of purpose and connection to something larger than himself. He's learned Apache traditions and language from Joseph Standing Bear and other tribal elders. He's become a bridge between cultures, helping visitors understand the significance of what they're experiencing. The story of Maria Mountain Walker has spread far beyond New Mexico. Researchers, historians, and spiritual seekers come from around the world to visit the site and learn about this remarkable woman who refused to let death stop her from protecting her people. The site has become a symbol of the continuing presence of Native American spiritual traditions in the modern world. Scientists continue to study the mystery of Maria's preservation and the supernatural phenomena surrounding her, but they've learned to accept that some aspects of her story may never be fully explained by conventional methods. The site has become a place where science and spirituality coexist, each offering different ways of understanding the same profound mystery. For Miguel, every day brings reminders of how a simple 12-peso purchase changed everything. He still has the rusty key that first opened the cabin door, and he carries it with him as a reminder that some of life's most important discoveries come when we're not looking for them. As he sits on his porch each evening, watching the sun set over the cabin where Maria Mountain Walker continues her eternal vigil, Miguel reflects on the incredible journey that started with a bargain too good to pass up. He learned that some purchases come with responsibilities that go far beyond money, and that the best investments are the ones that connect us to something greater than ourselves. Maria Mountain Walker found her way home after more than 150 years, and in doing so she helped Miguel find his true purpose. The giant Apache woman continues to protect the land and the people, just as she promised the spirits she would do. And Miguel Rodriguez, the rancher who bought an old cabin for 12 pesos, has become part of that eternal story of protection, honor, and love for the sacred places that connect us all.